Good evening. This seems an appropriate setting to tell the story of Abdow's Big Boy. Yes, coffee. And can I get some mozzarella sticks, onion rings, and fries off the Healthy Fit menu? Thanks. Oh, and what pies do you have? Chocolate cream? Let's plan on that for later. So, what happened to the Greater Springfield Metropolitan Area based Abdow's Big Boy restaurant chain? Why did it break with the Big Boys franchise brand in the 1990s and decide to go as an independent restaurant chain after a 32-year relationship? Why did it sell out to another chain in New England? What was its significance to the lives of the people who were its patrons? What was its economic contribution to the region? Why does it matter? For decades, Western and Central Mass, along with Connecticut, were a party to the iconic Big Boy brand of restaurants, due entirely to the efforts of the local franchisee, the Abdow family. Generations of families connected at the all-you-can-eat Sunday brunch after waiting in considerable lines outside for a table. Little children were regaled with the tales of Big Boy comics, which were even written at one point by Stan Lee, and fell asleep with the assistance of a Big Boy nightlight. Teenagers went on their first date at Abdow's Big Boys, worked their first jobs, and connected with and hung out with friends from high school or colleges. It has been said that in society, there is a need for that third place between home and work, and this was one of the key drivers for the success of the Starbucks chain. However, in a region that did not have any Starbucks, Abdow's had been in competition to be that location. It also brought in millions of dollars into the region from sales, profits that did not go out of the region to other areas of the country, but stayed local. It also had a certain cultural competency, a certain cultural currency. The very name Abdow, once synonymous with dinner and a specific concept of space, has no value today to anyone born in the 1990s or later, further widening the generational divide. Yet today, an entire generation has reached maturity without ever having heard of it, unless seamless transition. They saw this movie, the Austin Powers film, in which Dr. Evil went off into outer space in the iconic Big Boy statue. There was also a video featuring Big Boy on a flatbed truck that got some, I believe it was actually a Ford commercial, that got some widespread play. To best capture this business history, it was important to consider the evolutionary development of restaurants in America in general, and then the particular derivative strain that the Abdow's chain grew out of in its initial form. Having established that an entire generation grew up without Abdow's in its collective consciousness, it was essential to first establish exactly what it was. In order to accomplish that goal, an explanation of Big Boys was required. Abdow's was not the starter of the franchise. As particular outside the territorial confines, it was not connected to their times. For that to make sense, an overview of the evolution of food service in America up to the emergence of the Big Boy was needed. Hours of personal interviews with a surviving founder and a former vice president, as well as a review of legal incorporation documents and newspaper accounts all went into this. The Abdow's Corporation enjoyed explosive growth, in the mid to late 1970s. Value was the primary reason for the decoupling with the national brand. Multiple factors led the company leadership to sell off to the Bickford's chain a short time later in 1995. The cost of rebranding and renovating the restaurants, combined with a bad economy, a changing restaurant industry, changing demographics, the continued withering effects of the region's transition to a post-industrial labor market, as well as the growing age of the founders and a lack of succession planning, all contributed to the decision. Its contribution is realized in the memories of the patrons who frequented its locations and continues on in the restaurant labor force in the region that was born out of the experience of having been trained at an Abdow's, as well as the loss of millions of dollars in revenue from the area from a locally headquartered company. What would drive that success? Amazingly enough, friendship was the cause, at least indirectly. This was perhaps not the usual approach taught at the Harvard Business School, a close tie to the Shoney's operator, who was at the time still operating Big Boys before going to loan and rebranding, had led to the sudden boom in the mid to late 1970s. They had given them the buffet concept that could be leveraged for not only a robust salad bar, but a breakfast bar that would have lines out into the parking lot. This led to heightened demand such that there were those lines, and they actually had to expand the restaurants with atriums to meet the increased demand. This allowed for capital for new sites. By 1984, the restaurant was using 150,000 slices of bacon, 130,000 eggs, 85,000 sausage links, 5 tons of French fries, 4.5 tons of hash browns, 3.5 tons of lettuce, and 200 gallons of blue cheese dressing, heart healthy, in a typical week. This was about triple the amount needed prior to the chain opening its salad and breakfast buffet bars in 1980 and 1982, respectively, reflecting an increase in sales in the area of 10 to 12%. The volume allowed the company to take advantage of the economies of scale in wholesale supply purchasing. George Abdow was on record saying that each Big Boy restaurant was grossing $1.5 million a year, an amount that one analyst, Stephen A. Rockwell, stated would qualify as likely being the highest in the Big Boy chain in an unusually high volume. Roy Raskin of the Marriott Corporation placed the total gross sales for all Big Boy operations at $1 billion. With a pre-tax profit of about $100 million. Of Abdow's business, he said one of the most aggressive Big Boy operations in the United States, either at or near one of the top grossing per store operations in the country. By focusing on running higher volume single stores, the Abdow's chain was going against the grain of many competitors in the Big Boy family, who are trying to grow by expanding into more and more markets more rapidly. For Abdow's, it was working quite well. They also did not have the headaches of having to service the sub-franchisees. This was the time and effort that could be put toward running their specific locations. It was a different vision. So with the future seeming bright in the 1980s, what had happened? Why had the franchise broken with the franchisor? Why had the bulk of the restaurants been sold off to another business in the 1990s? The problem began when Bob Wyan, Bob's Big Boy, the original creator, sold the company. And it resulted from the internecine conflicts with other franchisees. Marriott, as the new franchisor, lacked Wyan's commitment to quality. George in particular was unhappy with the new management. Ron would later tell him that he was mad, and justifiably so, because Marriott did not do a good job. Marriott did not do a good job running the franchise. They were only interested in fees, the franchise fee. A shift to more of a cost consciousness pervaded, whereas Wyan had provided great value for the franchise fee in terms of training, systems, research and development, support for the menu. Marriott was putting a lot less effort and fewer resources into the brand and into its franchisees. In their 1968-69 annual report for the Marriott Corporation, Big Boy was featured prominently as their lead property. By 1979, it wasn't featured at all. A very clear sign that the situation was changing was when Marriott dropped the shrimp bar at the annual conventions. The days of celebrating the franchisees were over. Successful companies often struggle under new ownership. Boston Market withered under McDonald's. Friendly struggled under the hand of Hershey's, who could just never seem to understand the restaurant business. And as did the Imperial Group when they purchased Howard Johnson's and ran them into the ground before eventually selling them off to Marriott, who then converted them to what? Big Boys. There was something common about the failure of larger corporations buying successful ventures, but lacking both the commitment and the skill to run them effectively. By 1994, the Abdow's brothers were seasoned restaurant operators. While not an unreasonable amount, the franchise fee was no longer providing what they felt they needed in regard to training, research, development, or marketing. Despite all the numerous and sometimes contradictory or even random attempts, the Elias brothers, who took over for Marriott, was not a match for their needs. Their business model differed from that of the entire chain. They were doing a lights out dinner business and had lines at their breakfast buffets. Most of their fellow Big Boys were still really just burger joints. Abdow's didn't even have drive-through windows. They were a dinner restaurant provider. With the Elias brothers as the new franchisor, the chain began to take on more of a Midwestern base, reflected in both its menu and its advertising. In the Northeast, there was more of a push for healthier eating options. They also had George, one of the founders, who had a real savvy sense of advertising on his own, and there were opportunities to promote the local brands, such as sponsoring the, at the time, rising UMass basketball program via the Abdow's Basketball Classic. Abdow's had been good community patrons, sponsoring blood drives and scholarships. The money that they were spending on the franchise fee could be repurposed to operations and better marketing. They were also aware that other big boy operators like Eaton Park, Shoney's, JB's, and Marcus had left the chain, as well as Shoney's, and Eaton Park at least were thriving. It came down to a vote between George Abdow, Ron Abdow, the brothers Abdow, and their general manager. George wanted to leave due to the loss of value. Ron wanted to stay. He worried that they would lose market share by dropping the Big Boy Burger because it was a really great sandwich and a very popular menu item. The brand also was really embedded in their territory. The swing vote was their GM. He voted to leave. The decision was made. A year later, the former Abdow's Big Boy locations would be sold to Elksey Corporation, the parent company of the Bickford restaurant chain. The plan was to convert most of Bickford's restaurants. The Abdow Corporation would continue to operate its remaining dining houses, the PJ Scott's and the Ivanhoe. They would be a smaller company and would also devote time to managing the real estate portfolio. What had happened in a year? The New England economy was in a free fall. The collapse of the aforementioned in the paper, Massachusetts Miracle, had led the region to enter recession of the early 1990s, earlier, deeper, and longer than the rest of the nation. Ron himself was cited as a source about the economy. He found stagnation in 1992 after years of declining, noting, "This is not a recession, it's a depression." They were also facing employee healthcare costs that had begun to rise and replacing a strain on many businesses, including restaurants. The market was also changing. The prime customer base that had been the bedrock of the business was aging. They were no longer looking for a place to bring their small children. They wanted a place where they could get a drink. National chains for the first time began moving into the Springfield market and began to oversaturate it. Ron and George, who had both been former football players and accomplished college football officials, had never shied away from competition. They always thrived upon it. This time, though, Ron was worried. According to Steve Abdow, a lot of it had to do with market change and the dynamic of the restaurant business changing. The region was changing in other ways. Once the source of our thriving precision manufacturing industry that included high-wage, low-skilled jobs, the area had continued to shed those positions and shutter its factories, a process that had been underway for decades. The area was rapidly becoming one of the poorest in the nation. Ron and George were aging. George was 76. They had not established a clear succession plan or a structure to support it. The restaurants were also aging. They were in need of major renovations. The type of considerable remodeling would take substantial capital, risk, and a long-term commitment. It was a gut check. Faced with an aggressive expansionist restaurant operator looking to add units in the Bickford's chain and with uncertainty on the horizon, despite all the storms the chain had weathered, they demurred. They may have been prescient. By 2002, the parent company for Bickford's showed a loss of $6.5 million and spun off Bickford's as another subsidiary. By 2020, there would be 2 Bickford's locations left, neither of which had been any of the former Abdow's restaurants. Elias Brothers, the new franchisor for the Bickford, for the Big Boy chain, rather, would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2000. They experienced a lack of liquidity and had to close 43 of their restaurants. They had $100 million in debt. They agreed to sell it to Robert Liggett Jr., who was a former radio station owner who had sold off to Citadel Communications and bought everything for $50 million, including 455 of B. Elias Brothers restaurants. And he rebranded as Big Boy International. It would be wrong to write off the Abdow's impact on the region. The legacy lived on. The restaurants in the region better managed through the employees trained in the Abdow's restaurant incubator, fueled through the superior training protocols and systems developed by Bob Wyand's Big Boy operation. It lived on too in the memories of those families who had experienced the restaurants, true safe havens for growing up, with superior burgers, generous buffets and salad bars, decadent pies, and Big Boy nightlights and comic books. I even had a Big Boy nightlight, I'm not gonna lie. In a world of insincere business practices, Abdow's family restaurants with and without Big Boy provided good value and good values. This is a legacy anyone would and should be proud to own. Thank you. I've enjoyed taking this class with you, and I wish you all the best.